How are you?
I'm very well. What a fantastic intro. I feel like I should wrap it up now because I can only disappoint from that introduction.
I feel like we should wrap it up now because we're out of time.
Yeah. All right, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
um, what went through your mind when you heard the podcast version of this thing?
Um, that I would like to take my spinal cord out of my body and give it a hug and put it someplace safe because I was so tremendously creeped out by the podcast is so good at setting the horror of what Duntsch did, that I found myself completely creeped out by it. And then because I knew at this point that I'd been offered the job, also really compelled by the how the hell did this guy happen? How the hell did he happen? And how the hell did he keep on happening? And that was really the first inkling that I had that I knew that I really wanted to play the role was that 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 I immediately had questions, right? That I wanted to delve deeper into it because it's just so outlandish, the story of the man and the outcome of what he did.
Tell me more about wanting to inhabit him, though.
Well, because he seems impossible, or I guess my imagination wanted him to be impossible, and I wanted a simple answer. My initial reaction was like, well, what is he's a psychopath, or he was beaten as a child, or what the hell happened? Like there has to be an answer to why this guy did the things that he did. And the story, like everything in life, is just more complex than that. And the deeper I got into it, the more questions that I had, and the more curious I became. And that to me is that's really, as an actor, that's what you want, right? You want to continually dig and dig and dig and find more and more things that you want to uncover and explore. And I also, the podcast tells one version of the story, and then our show tells another version of the story, or centers a different place in the story. And I thought it was a brave trick for Patrick to try to pull with the audience, that you center the devil rather than centering, say, the heroes, right? You spend a lot of time getting into Christopher Duntsch and where he came from and how he came to be inside of the structure of our show. And I thought that was a much more compelling version of a bad guy, of a villain, right? Because if you turned him into just the mustache twirling evildoer, it kind of lets you off the hook as an audience member, because then he's just the bad guy and you don't have to worry about him too much. But if you try to present him as to a point, a recognizable human being, he gets much scarier. And I thought that was really interesting.
Do you have to have empathy for him in order to play him?
Yes. And it's funny. You have to have empathy for him, but not as him. So the biggest psychological barrier for me getting into the character was my own judgment of him and what he did. And once I was able to wrap my head around the idea that he's his own hero, that he really believes that he's the hero of his own story, and that he was the victim of his patients and the hospitals that he worked for and the nurses and doctors that he worked with and his baby mamas and his parents, and that blah, 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 the whole world conspired against him. And once I got inside of that and recognized that for him, at least in my take of him, there was no consciousness of guilt, right? He was a misunderstood genius railing against an antiquated system, and ultimately was brought down by small-minded people around him, rather than a monster who lacked any sort of self-awareness or basic human empathy, who permanently mangled 31 people and murdered two.
I mean, Joshua, like I've never acted. I don't have any background in acting, and stuff like that just still blows me away, I guess, sometimes. That not only are you playing a pretty reprehensible person here, but a real person who did exist and did so much to these people. And at a certain point, at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, you got to go home and not be that anymore. What's that like?
I wish I could say that you just leave it all at work. There are days when it's harder than others, and particularly, there's a price to pay even for the happiest and the most heroic of characters. There's a price you pay every day for being inside of some dramatic scenario, right? Every scene has some amount of cost emotionally, but to be inside of this human who completely lacks empathy and the self-awareness to recognize the damage that he's doing to other people is antithetical to how I want to be as a human being, and was definitely this character wore on me more than most, and in fact, when I finished it, I think it was even heavier than I recognized while I was doing it, because once I finally put him down, finally was done with him, the sense of relief of like just of being able to breathe freely again was unlike pretty much anything I'd ever done before.
Yeah, you do seem, if you don't mind me saying so, you do seem affected by it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an awful space to live in emotionally and psychologically for 6 months, 8 months, 7 months, whatever it was. And, it is unhuman to not have an empathetic reaction to another human in distress. And it is inhumane as a doctor to not have an empathetic reaction to another human being in distress that you have caused. And so when you're playing these scenes, there's a war inside yourself as a human being, where the Josh side of me is like screaming to reach out and have some sort of human contact with this human who's in pain, and the Duntsch side of me doesn't see that, just misses it, just has no ability to make that human to human connection. So yeah, there is a burden to playing this character, for sure.
It is hard to turn away from this show. It's hard to turn it off. It's quite gripping, and even though there are moments that I was surprised, I was still sort of drawn in. I mean, it's sort of gory in an imaginative way. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of implied goriness. Now, I know that I can imagine people listening to this and going, like, once they hear the word gore, I mean to stay. It's not quite like that, but like it's gory through its sounds and the sounds of surgery. And how was that for you as an actor in those scenes?
Well, so what's interesting is when we're in those scenes, there's a bit of a dance that goes on inside of that, right? So it's a lot about the props and making sure that the sequence of events and the sequence of the tools and all of that is medically correct, so that it passes the sniff test for anybody who actually knows what they're doing watching. But what we don't have in there is the sound design and the score and what that adds. Because I will tell you that when I watched when I watched the final cut with everything in it of the first episode, and we got into the first surgery scene, I had to watch it through closed fingers, because when you get into the sound design and you hear the little squishy noises and you hear the medical tools, and it lights up a piece of your imagination. In fact, in some ways, it calls back to the podcast itself. The beauty of, or radio, frankly, is that you as an audience member get to fill in the spaces that are implied by the sound. And in the case of Dr. Death, the place that your imagination goes is your worst nightmare, to the absolute darkest and ugliest place. And it's incredibly compelling, and it is at times very difficult to watch, because the show is actually not very gory at all. There's one sequence towards the latter portion of the season that really shows you the internal effects, but it is left mostly to your imagination, and I'll be honest, your imagination is more powerful than anything that we could possibly show you.
And am I wrong that in order to do this, you had to, like, in order to act as if you were doing spinal surgeries, you watched spinal surgeries?
Yeah, so I went, except for the thoracic surgeries, which I just never had a chance to go and see, I went and watched each of the procedures that are in the show. I went and watched one or a couple different versions of them, just to see, one, like, how an operating theater works for spinal surgeries, and to get a sense of it, and also just to to see the things that my imagination wasn't allowing me to see. So when I imagined surgery, I think of it as something very delicate because I kind of want to think that they're taking like sweet and gentle care of our bodies. But spinal surgeries are violent.
There's
really
hammers.
violent.
There's,
Hammers,
Yeah.
hammers, screws. I mean, to get a screw into bone is exactly as hard as it sounds. And so when a surgeon is putting a pedicle screw into one of your pedicles, they're having to put some elbow grease behind that. And it is extremely intense to watch.
How did you do? How did you do with it?
First surgery, when I looked down into the surgical area into the spinal cord and saw the blood pulsing through, I'm blanking on the name of the vein that runs through the dura there, but saw a live cross section basically of a human spine. I definitely had that, thankfully, internal moment of like, we might pass out right now.
We have two of our producers are in the other room, and the reason I keep on looking over there is that they have squeamishness around this, and they are running around the studio, just holding their head in their hands, just grossed out by you describing it, as opposed to you. Because I imagined you with, like, as on Seinfeld, just throwing the junior mint in there or something like that, but it was
yeah. Well, I mean, obviously I wasn't allowed to touch the body in any way, but you definitely have that, like, when you're standing over looking down into a human body and you have that moment where it's kind of an acting moment. Like, you look up into the face of the surgeon and he's describing all the pieces and you're thinking to yourself, can you see I'm about to completely fall out right here? And you do it. He's like, and this is the lesson. And you're like, until, everything starts to calm down. You're like, okay, I'm going to make it. I'm good. Okay, I'm good. I'm going to be fine.
If you're just tuning in, I'm speaking with Canadian actor Joshua Jackson about the new NBC Peacock series, Dr. Death. I think it would be a mistake to refer to Christopher Duntsch or Dr. Death as the only villain in this thing. And it did feel, watching it, and maybe this is my Canadianness watching it, but I don't think it is. It felt like certain parts of the American healthcare system that would allow this kind of behavior were also the villains here too. In making this show, were you able to draw any conclusions around healthcare down there?
So, in order to answer that, I'm going to name drop, because why not?
Bill Clinton.
Yeah, not quite that one. So a couple years ago, I was in a show called When They See Us, which was directed by Ava DuVernay. And over the course of promoting that show, I happened to be either in a panel or an audience, but I was listening to her speak. And somebody asked her about the American justice system. And she said the system, someone was asking her about reform. And she said, the system doesn't need to be reformed because it's working exactly as it was designed to work. And that really caught me off guard in the moment, because there's clearly such inequity inside of that system. And as I got into the story of Dr. Death, that answer came back to me over and over again, that what took place, Christopher Duntsch is obviously responsible for the things that he did. And I'm not absolving him at all from his responsibility for those things. But they could not have happened by themselves, right? They didn't happen out on an island. They needed to be supported by a system around him. And as much as I wanted to believe that something had gone wrong, what I came to believe is that the system was working exactly as it was intended to. As soon as you turn a patient into a profit center, you have warped the concept of medicine. And it was the determination of each one of the hospitals that Christopher Duntsch worked at that it was less costly to just shuffle him along to the next place in the system than it was to deal with the bodies that he had mangled. And that's partially because of the fact that he was practicing in Texas, and Texas has incredibly regressive laws around patient or victim malpractice payouts. So the actual physical dollar cost that they had to pay out to each one of those victims was less than they would have had to pay out to Christopher Duntsch if he had sued them. And they made the determination that they were willing to stand by multiple and then ultimately 33 horrendously affected patients, victims of Christopher Duntsch, rather than deal with him directly on a purely cost basis. And that is really terrifying. And it's hard as a Canadian to wrap our heads around it because it is antithetical to how our system is built, and really it should be antithetical to how any medical system is built. But it is the, it's the central sin of the American medical system. And until the populace of America demands a better and more responsible and equitable system, outcomes like Duntsch are actually signs of that profit motive functioning rather than a breakdown in the system itself.
Yeah, I can only imagine as a Canadian it being, as someone, I'm cautious of getting on the Canadian superiority jag here, but I am nothing but unbelievably grateful for our healthcare system, and I can't imagine as someone who grew up in the Canadian healthcare system looking into this world.
Well, so am I. There's a couple of things that, like, our healthcare system does a couple of beautiful things that actually I don't think have anything to do with medical outcomes. One, and I think this is maybe most important, and this to me is a thing that I see all the time in the States, because we all put into it, there is a real sense of connectivity across the entire country. And in many ways that we're fragmented by culture, region, distance, whatever. Hockey team we support, whatever the things that are different between us, there's a sense of Canadianness.
We're all getting the same healthcare. We are all deserving of the same treatment.
Yeah, and that is, it really, really, really is a very different psychological place, cultural place for us to be. Because in the States, I'm a union member in the States. I mean, I'm a union member up here too, but one of the benefits of being in my good union down there is that I have access to decent healthcare. But that's really not the case for the vast majority of Americans. And so there's this punitive, competitive, open market idea of like, well, I need to scramble to get the best that I can get, and I can only get it if it's at the cost of you, right? There's this feeling of competition inside of really everything, but in the medical system, it is particularly grotesque because the outcomes that it leads to fail most of the people that interact with the American medical system. Like I still forget my union card all the time whenever I go to the doctor's office, because I forget that, oh yeah, you will not actually give me medical care unless I can prove to you that I have this insurance. Whereas in Canada, sure, I have to have my SIN number, kind of, but like if I need care, you will give me care and we'll work out the rest later, right? And it just changes the perspective that people have. And so there's that aspect of it. And then there's the other aspect of it, which is when people get turned into profit centers, like I said, it warps the entirety of the medical system. So it's very hard to know as a patient inside of the American medical system if the treatments and the tests and the everything that you're being prescribed are actually for your benefit or because they're expensive and can be billed to the insurance company. And there always has to be that question because the system is built to make money. And as long as it's built to make money, it's impossible to divorce human motivations from the system itself, and it will continue to try to mine money out of its patients. And maybe when you're buying a car, you can be an informed consumer, but when you're a patient, you are not.
There's a scene at the end where they ask how they found Dr. Duntsch's contact, and they say, "Oh yeah, I found this website, 5 stars website." And as a Canadian, it was hard for me to fully wrap my head around that. I'm getting the wrap sign, so I do want to ask one more. I did want to ask one more thing, and I'll beg forgiveness from your folks there later on. It's another thing that crossed my mind watching this. I was wondering if you could give me a brief summary of the entire American healthcare system. No, I'm only joking. One thing that crossed my mind was just how long you've been at it, if you don't mind me saying so. And I think during the pandemic, I went down a couple of solid nostalgia holes and watched. I know you from Mighty Ducks, not as much from Dawson's Creek. And all I can imagine is that people who get big acting roles like that when they're kids oftentimes stop, oftentimes have challenges, and oftentimes find their way into something noble, roofing or something like that. And I could think, my God, he's still doing powerful roles. He's still doing roles that are meaningful to him. Could you have imagined in those days that you'd still be here 30 years later?
No. I mean, no. In the beginning of my career, it was hard for me to imagine being there 2 years later, 1 year later. It seemed like every job was the end of the road. And yeah, I mean, I've been lucky enough to survive multiple cycles of my own career. It is just like life. It's not a single linear trajectory that you're on. And I am constantly amazed, because I too am amazed that 30 years in, I'm like, wow, I'm still doing this. This is crazy. And I'm amazed that I've been able to like navigate it, survive it. But also, I think, it's in any creative field, it can be hard. And I've certainly gone through phases where it has been less interesting, but it can be hard to stay motivated and to stay curious, right? And I'm very thankful that I'm here at 43 and in a place where I have access to the types of material that I want to be working on. And then also this, this unbelievable, I was born in the right era, right? Like, it just so happens that the whole industry has moved towards, TV, whatever TV is now, streaming, right? And not all the most, but most of the most interesting stories are being told in that format now. And that's where where I've done all of my work for the last little while. And I'm at a place in my career where I have access, not to everything that I want, but enough interesting things that here I am at 43 and feel like I'm just in the beginning of the most interesting phase of my career.
It's a powerful story, and it's so great to see you both on screen and in front of me right now, I suppose. Love
but
it.
I wish I would have known. I should have asked, but I just assumed that everything is still done by remote, because it would have been actually nice to physically see you and be in the studio. But next time.
Next time, and I got a fridge full of beer underneath this, and we'll
I promise it's not only the beer the reason I wanted to come in, but the beer helps.
Yeah. I got a couple of April wine records. It'll be great. Josh, always lovely to see you, and thanks for making the time.
Thank you.
Joshua Jackson's new series, Dr. Death, is out now on NBC's streaming service Peacock. He joined me here on Q. It premieres in Canada on Showcase this Sunday, September 12th.